I would like to thank you for taking the time to listen to my thoughts about music, piano, thinking, teaching, recording, playing, writing, describing, organizing, transcribing, improvising, discovering, rediscovering, bringing, transmitting. I feel like ultimately, while it looks so narcissistic and so unnecessary to be a pianist, um, and in a way, it can be philosophically reflective, but in a way that it appears that one is isolated from the people with whom one shares this music, either by a stage, either by a screen. And I must say that this has often bothered me because I find that ultimately responding to a musical appeal is not towards representing yourself, making the music, bringing it to life from a dead scroll. It is more about responding to a calling that you feel is as important in the intellectual, possibly soulful, more surely, earnest way of englobing in few sounds some kind of history of humankind's emotions, hopes, and reflections. Somehow, as if everything in music is said in a more direct way than words, even if they're carefully chosen, beautifully chosen by writers, poets, incredibly well translated to convey a message besides the sound of the word itself, since nobody speaks all the languages of the world and nobody understands all the languages of music either, even if it's a cliche to call it an international language. It has its grammar, after all, and in plural, actually, because it seems to me that when music started becoming recorded and published, therefore retained in a form that is no more necessitating the personal existence of the performer to transmit it, like oral transmission, is that it can be used either as a recorded pattern of industry or published, and it's taught through these medias. There is a moment where the immediacy of music making is no more necessary, and therefore composers into the early 20th century onwards, compared to the composers up till the 19th century, were in fact with more freedom to imagine, rethink the very musical language they used to transmit this message, narrative, storytelling, philosophical, or uplifting spiritually, or entertaining for dance, or singing, even with lyrics or without. But the point is that whichever genre and form you have for the music necessity for people to pray, to bury, to marry, to christen, to dance, to watch storytelling on film, where the music is the ingredient of the psychological connection. All these things can be rethought because one has time. And that luxury Haydn, Schubert, Mozart, Bach didn't have. They had to produce constantly to survive. And now that composers from the 20th century onwards, like Stravinsky and others, were able to have time to rethink their language, to change their style, to adopt other cultures of musical oral tradition, such Messiaen and Bartok, in the ethnomusicological approach, and then the intellectual approach of post-tonalism, atonalism and serialism and all the isms. It unfortunately brought through recordings and publications a certain distance, not only with the audience and the music lovers, but it also brought a sense of intellectualization of the music process for the composers. And then the direct access to the large audience was left to pop music, whichever style it took to be, from rock, pop, rap, and all these. So in a way, that is the problem. Classical music lost its connection with the general audience of the non-musicians. So it is reducing itself to an elitism. And I find that it's important to manage to respect and serve this branch of search through avant-garde, electronics, rethinking of the whole alphabet of music. That unfortunately becomes more and more difficult because more and more composers seem to create their own. So they become hermetically locked for people who have a general approach to music. And until and if one makes the effort, it becomes like learning a foreign language to read a specific novel. And that's limited in time, and in time that people have for those who would like to read them. And the translations don't exist that much for that. Perhaps the interpreters are the best translators etymologically when they are championing music of such a difficult access with conviction and charisma, and conveying another energy, another daydreaming, another escapism than Schubert, Mozart, Chopin, Debussy, Fauré, Mendelssohn, Bach before and after Stravinsky included. But then it seems to me like if that is already selfish situation to spend one's time to improve one's own piano playing, for what purpose? To touch whom and how? Electronically or in person on stage? And for which group of people, with which attraction towards an art form that may or not, mostly actually, appear not to be for them? And there is a divorce between the music lover and the classical, modern, contemporary, avant-garde musician, either composing or performing, or both. Of course, you have to do it with the same conviction as a performer as if you play somebody's music from centuries ago, because in a way, the mystery could be the same, even if you work with the composer or not, being alive. Some composers don't want. I have called several when I have students playing of their music and they refuse to. I thought it would be nice for the students to know the opinion of the composer, but perhaps ultimately is because the piece doesn't belong to them, other than in author rights, obviously. But in terms of the ownership of its meaning, of its interpretation, and so do they not care if it's not played the way they think it should be? Or do they accept with great alterity that others, therefore being the alterity, will with therefore for the composers a certain sense of Now, um, openness to that alterity, accepting that other people will see something different in their piece than they thought they embedded in it. This general word that I was sort of searching for the last few minutes is tolerance. Now, tolerance is difficult to perhaps expect from a composer who has thought each detail of a written score, therefore leaves apparently very little room for interpretation, therefore for something to be done other than in beyond and above or between the notes, the patterns, the rhythms and all. I think they should be thankful that other people want to play them. I mean, so am I. I am very thankful when other people play my music. I don't interfere in the way they play it or the way they should be playing it. I don't feel like I have any right, as a composer in this case, to impose some kind of only aspect of the piece being my point of view, just because I wrote it, as if only the parents know their children best. Sometimes the significant others do too. Of course, from a different point of view at a different time. So nobody of the performers is there when the composer composes the piece they will perform. It happens always after, shortly after, or a long time after, but after. And that after is their own present, and that is their own belonging to the piece as a statement, as a excitement, as an inspiration, as a daydreaming, as an escapement, as whatever it is. But it becomes their mantra, their conviction in a way. And they play it because it means to them, or it's good connecting with their own seeking in music. Perhaps they're yearning for a piece like this, and it didn't exist by Bartok and Chopin and the great composers that we play anyway. And all of a sudden they connect with the musical experience more than language, but through the language, the expression, philosophy of life, way of thinking, organizing, generosity, emotion, reflection, organization of thoughts specifically for this or that. Of course, the more you play a composer's music that you like, the more you're curious to understand it more, so you realize little by little more about the different pieces of the toolbox that the composer uses for a given instrument's writing. In a way, you can find it in different pieces of this composer. Well, of course, if you play only one piece by a specific composer, then you don't have the same approach than when you play, let's say, a Mozart or a Chopin piece, having played 10 of them before you play another 10 during the course even of your studies only, let less in life. So it's not one off, it is the. And that unique approach becomes exclusive and perhaps misunderstood or in the eyes of the composer, but with an incredible connection for the performer, for whom the piece means so much. It's an appropriation, it's almost like an adopted child. It becomes their own. They defend it on stage, they're afraid to disturb it if they make mistakes. They are admirative, caring, and realizing its vulnerability because it remains in your technique, in your memory, in your organization of thoughts. And if your technique fails you, their artistry fails too. But the point is that you work until you manage to find the technique that corresponds to either shiftings or runnings or different ranges or complex textures or light textures, pulse rhythm, the way it carries itself as a message. It perhaps not very clear in the beginning, and the teacher could help, hopefully, the publisher has enough information, but I don't believe so much in the words information on a score than in the analytical understanding, perhaps more than understanding as well as, of course, learning, intuitive connection. The intuition is so important. It connects you to a ballade by Chopin as by a contemporary composer. And if there is an intuitive connection, it's an unstoppable desire for it. It doesn't become just an obligation because it's part of a repertoire or a part of a competition repertoire or part of a job audition repertoire, which could be the case too. You have to use some things to prove that therefore you're worthy of the prize or of the job or of the promotion or whatever it is. I'm very impressed always when I hear people play music and you realize that even if you don't know the piece, their conviction is so compelling. And if you know the piece and they play it in a way that you never thought it should be or you thought it could be played, for whichever reasons, I don't want to give only details, but it is part of things like rhythm and tempo and general feel if you put it all together. But then that is the beauty of being tolerant, is to be amazed by how much differently the same piece can mean to different people. And what it means is that it becomes a conviction and they play it with a way you wouldn't or you didn't think of, but you go, wow. And you realize, therefore, by this exclamation, I think, that a musical composition is not locked in its notation that much from variance. It's not locked in its recording by famous or trusted performers of this genre or this style of this composer, living or dead. It's a lot about the fact that you arrive chronologically into the piece a few years after it was composed, or a few months, or a few decades, or a few centuries. But it is your present. It is meaningful to you, regardless of the time passing, the genres, the styles, the instruments on which you play, the acoustics, the resonances, the way, regardless if you like how people play it or not, but you find something that is so personal. It's like reading a novel and finding a purpose in it that is not the same as your neighbor reading the same novel, even silently in their minds, compared to music, which is always played by somebody. So it sort of already adds a subjective element to it. I think it calls for a lot of humility to accept this tolerance and to be constantly driven by finding what it means to you and how you can help what it means to the student who is discovering it. In that sense, it's a very responsible situation to be the teacher. A hyphen between the composer and the student.